we're going to cover the broad topics of institutionalized planning and then transportation planning. So here's some of the feedback that we've gotten over the past couple of years in institutionalized planning, starting with airport planning. Question about airport siting, planning near airports, control of land uses adjacent to an airport. How would you do that? Things like that. Airport adjacent zoning considerations. Trying to deal with noise contours. They felt they were fairly obvious. I also had airport plans. Okay, and military planning. And some of that's related to airports, airfields. They were asking about the AQs process. If you don't know what that is, we'll talk about it tonight. Just review the special district overlay zoning. We'll talk about that when we talk about the AQs JLUS process. Appropriate uses near a military base. We'll talk a little bit about that. School planning, several school-related questions, elements in a comp plan that deal with school planning, knowing Clarence Perry, what constitutes a neighborhood, what's the population that's going to support an elementary school, some questions about financing, school for schools, knowing the schools are the basis for the neighborhood unit big enough to fill an elementary school. So you can see some of those aspects. Library planning, which surprised some few people. We've touched on it from time to time, but tonight we'll try to deal with what seems to be coming up. Ask the first step of library planning. Need to know the number of trips generated about libraries. 2 questions on library planning. What do you need to study first when adding a library to an area? Another person recommended that we try to cover it now in the spring. Another question that tied library planning to trip generation. Although I've gotten some indication that it may be having to know which is the dependent variable and which is the independent variable when you come to doing trip generation. And it just happens that they use a library example, but we need to learn what library trip generation is about too. One library question, we covered it in class one time. Sometimes that covered in class can mean the weekend question sessions, because sometimes we'll have questions come up on Saturdays that we don't have topics focus on. Like typically in the fall, I don't get to cover institutional or library planning, but in the spring I do. Only 2 questions I remember. One was, what was the idea of a third place, which we'll talk about that, which they picked up from a practice question we did. Okay, religious planning. Basically knowing RLUIPA. It's the main thing I do. One RLUIPA question, just need to know, treat religious organization like you would anybody else. We'll talk about what RLUIPA says and how to deal with it. And then some people have been getting some questions on hospitals related to hazard, dealing with hazards. Resilience applied to post-disaster hospital. Difficult question on the best first step related to flooding hospitals in an area. Best first step to ensure hospitals are built to withstand natural disasters. So we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. So anyway, that gives you sort of a general broad range of what some of the questions recently have been on those different areas, including airports, military, schools, library, religious facilities, and also hospitals. Okay. So I'm going to start off with we first started getting airport questions. I had a friend of mine who had gone through our class, gotten their AICP, and was both a GIS person, so she helped us with GIS sessions, as well as she went to work as an aviation planner. So she put together a little presentation. It's probably a little bit of overkill, but it will cover some of the things we want to cover. So airport planning, piece of cake, right? It's out in the middle of nowhere. Well, not always out in the middle of nowhere. Here you can see Gibraltar. They have to deal with a road that goes through the middle of the runway. And Miami, which is constrained by development all around it. So what's different about airport planning? Well, we have lots of extra regulations, including from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, You have lots of land use compatibility considerations that relate to noise and noise contours, that relate to airspace and making sure that the airspace is clear. All that can also get into high-rise stuff. Also wildlife, particularly flying wildlife. And radio interference, that again can be high-rise and other types of interference, and ground safety issues. And then now, increasingly, we're getting things like drones and having to worry about spaceports. And of course, now in this state, we're having to worry a lot about presidential visits. We've got General Aviation Airport that gets shut down. It's a public aviation, general aviation. It gets shut down totally every time the president comes to Mar-a-Lago. And of course, there are certain restrictions on how close airplanes can come to Mar-a-Lago when he's there. And also, that has some restrictions on some of the commercial aviation that goes on from Palm Beach International. All right, so useful resources, because they can help on the exam. There's a report on enhancing airport land use compatibility. It's a free resource, gets into a lot of compatibility. There's a past report that I will place on the FDP site. It's airport and land use compatibility. And you can see some of the topics it gets there. How do you develop a strong airport vision? How do you envision potential futures through master planning? Enhancing airport land use compatibility, which seems to be more what comes up a little bit on the exam. And then other things you do environmentally and things like that. So airport community planners must work together. They must understand and consider the needs and the concerns of the community and make use of the airport. All right, the first big area deals with its airport noise regulations. There is some regulations. There's a past report out there from 1992, and of course you now have access to that free, so you can go look at that. The Blue Book has about 12 pages of stuff on airport planning, and it covers things like airport land use interface, what is airside development, what is landside development. That sometimes comes up in the exam. We're going to talk about it a little bit, but the Blue Book has some good pages. So common airport terms. There's the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. You can see what so there's large hub, medium hub, small hubs, non-hub primaries, and reliever airports. So there's a whole gradation of different types of airports around the country. Enplanements. An enplanement is a revenue passenger who boarded the aircraft at an airport. General aviation is that segment of aviation that encompasses all aspects of civil aviation except certified air carriers and other commercial operators such as air freight. It's the largest group of airports in the United States. Reliever airports are specifically designated, and they relieve congestion from the main commercial service airports and provide general aviation access to the community. Fixed base operator, those are businesses that are located at an airport that provide services to pilots, including aircraft rental, training, fueling, maintenance, parking, and the sale of pilot supplies. So those are things at the airport that provide services to pilots and the aircraft. All right. Airside, that portion of the airport that supports aircraft and aircraft-related activities. So the gates, the runways, the taxiways, the apronways, the hangars, as well as the airspace surrounding the airport. That's the airside. Landside is the portion of an airport that provides the facilities necessary for processing of passengers, cargo, freight, ground transportation vehicles. All right. Apron is a specified portion of the airfield used for passenger, cargo, or freight loading, unloading, aircraft parking, and the refueling, maintenance, and servicing of aircraft. Regulatory framework. All right. First of all, there's a whole set of Federal Aviation Administration regulations. They're known as FAR, so don't confuse it with floor-area ratio, but Federal Aviation Regulations. There's ones that deal with the airspace, deal with noise compatibility, deal with certification airports, and on and on and on. Okay, where do some of the funding sources come from? The obligations things. FAA Airport Improvement Program, money comes from the airport and the Airport Trust Fund, which is funded mainly from excise tax paid by users of the air system. There's an annual formula grant entitlements based upon number of plane passengers, cargo weights, and then there are discretionary funds to fund eligible capital improvement programs. There are passenger facility charges. These are local user fees collected by the airport and part of the airports. And then there's state grants and general aviation revenue bonds, secured by airports' future revenue. These are common at large airports. So passenger enplanements, they're collected for the full calendar year. And they look at that determines the entitlements for the next fiscal year for the money. Gives you some idea. Miami there, I think this is for current year 13 was 19 million plane passengers. Fort Lauderdale was about 11. All right, noise land reuse plan required when grants are used to buy lands affected by airport noise. Airport master plans. Comprehensive study of an airport, there's pre-planning, public involvement, environmental considerations, existing conditions. Then you'll get forecasts for how much aviation you're going to have in certain time frames, facility requirements, alternatives, the layout plans, just like a lot of normal planning. And you'll get terminal area forecasts, enplanements, airport operations. So you see, so then you get into planning. Your airport master plan will plan your land side, your air side, and your terminals. Okay, and you may get some additions about whether or not you're going to need additional gates or different changes and redevelopment. So your layout plans are how you're physically going to put your detailed plan that shows your existing future airfield layout, where your runways are, your taxiways, etc., and where your buildings are, what type of obstruction services you might have to worry about, where are your protection zones, where are your runway safety areas, and your obstacle-free zones, etc. So you have all of that put on a plan. All right. Let's see. So safe, efficient preservation of navigable airspace. So you look at notification if anything's going to be a hazard to the airspace. Any located on the airports, regardless of height, would be an issue. Any that are going to be more than 200 feet above ground. Then you project out an imaginary surface extending outward and upward at a certain slope. Anything that's going to be within inside that envelope is an issue. And so you get into everything, fences and sometimes drilling rigs and all sorts of things. So that's what they look like. And you can see where their envelope is going off down here out, and they're planning anything, look at whether anything's going to be involved in that area. So you're looking for in a 3D level, you're trying to look at obstacle clearance areas and what happens if you get one engine inoperative, where it's going to have to emergency land, etc. Ground safety, because accidents happen. So you have your runway protection zone. It used to be called clear zones. These are, you're trying to protect people and property on the ground. So you're trying to look at buildings and structures, recreational uses, transportation facilities. So examples may be things that you're worried about is maybe golf courses. So golf course, certain places off those runway protection zones, that may be a problem. Sports fields, other things. Less of an issue, of course, and not really an issue, is going to just be open space. But if it's got trees and birds and things like that, then there may be some issues. So all sorts of other storage facilities, bug ground, things like that. All right, so trying to use planning tools, airport noise overlay zones. Abrogation easement is a contractual right for the property interest in land over which a right of unrestricted flight is established. That's an abrogation easement. And then you get into height and land use zoning, as we talked about. Noise compatibility. Okay, this sometimes has come up on the exam. Decibel, it's a scale from the threshold of human hearing, around 0 decibels, upwards towards the threshold of pain, which is about 120 to 140 decibels. Think about a loud rock concert. Decibel A, the A-weighted decibel is used for measuring environmental sound levels. Then you do different types of day-night noise levels for over a 24-hour period, and they may have different slightly noise levels allowed. But between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. at night, you're penalized 10 decibels, because there's higher human sensitivity at night to sleep disturbance. So you look at your decibel night level contour, day-night level contour, and basically what you're looking for is define significant noise exposure as any area that's within a 65 decibel DNL contour. That's the basic contour. Remember that 65 dB. Okay. And then so what you do is you draw them out. You see what's going to be affected and what type of land use is involved in there, and then you have to try to deal with mitigation of that. So for residential, things like that, you want basically below 65 dB. Certain other type of uses can withstand a little higher, like office, can go up to maybe 70. And some uses like mining or fishing may be able to go up even as high as over 85. So basically, where the community determines that residential school uses must be allowed, inside the zone, measures to achieve outdoor to indoor noise level reductions of at least 25 dB or 30 dB should be incorporated into the building codes. So you can see general, not just a pictorial. It gives you a little idea what type of zones, where it's red, they're incompatible with the type of use, but commercial, industrial, agricultural, you can allow higher, up to 75 and maybe above. It's not an official table, but it's easy to remember. Noise mitigation strategies, you may change the flight patterns. That's what Trump wanted Palm Beach International to do because of where Mar-a-Lago is. You may get curfews where you can't have the noise at certain times, so flights are limited. You may get barriers that you can, green belts and other ways you might be able to do it. Or you might insulate the non-compatible structures, insulate their windows or doors, etc. Or you may just outright buy them. And that just shows you some of the idea, and then shows you how many, this is at Fort Lauderdale, how many different complaints they had. So obviously they have an increase at that time, so they've got to deal with it. That's the first set on airport planning. I gotta get back to where I was here. All right, another one I want to show here a little bit. There is an APA report. It's just a brief report on compatible land use planning for areas adjacent to airports. I think most of it's pretty straightforward, but airports present serious challenges for their host communities when it comes to land use planning. They require large tracts of land. They produce varied impacts beyond their boundaries, and they serve a dynamic and growing industry that seems to be in constant transition. There's a balancing act that governments must do to minimize the risk that future populations will be exposed to airport-related impacts, but you have to protect the long-term viability of the airport by ensuring that Cushing development does not choke the long-term development needs, and ensure that urban development that's permitted in the airport area provides fair opportunities for property owners while producing lasting value to the community. So an especially difficult aspect of that interface relates to future airport facility requirements. So things like constructing a new runway or a relocation of an airport terminal can require substantial land acquisition, the rerouting of major highways, arterial streets, and the introduction of airport noise to new parts of the community. The inability to provide needed facilities, though, if you don't allow them, can seriously compromise the ability of the airport to accommodate airport demand travel. All right. And if a local government has established a land use plan and regulatory framework that promotes the orderly long-term development of the airport must have a long-term master plan that defines the broad outlines of the ultimate airport development. And I think that's about all, I guess a few more points. 4 factors to be successful. You need a consistent management approach and consistent support of the airport authority boards of directors throughout the period that they're starting to undertake planning and doing any expansions. You need strict zoning controls to protect airport approach airspace and to promote compatible land uses in the airport environment, especially off the ends of the planned runways. And you need a comprehensive noise compatibility program that establishes flight procedures to reduce noise exposure over neighborhoods. And the program needs to also provide for the mitigation of effects of noise in seriously affected neighborhoods through sound installation, acquisition, and relocation. And then you have to have an extensive land use acquisition program to be able to provide the airport authority with the land they need for facilities far in need of construction. And so the first step with all of this was to do a visionary master plan. So master planning is very important for airports to have in terms of trying to deal with the land use compatibility. Now, I'm going to switch to military planning, but it's going to have a lot of focus on airfields. Okay, so this is a zoning practice article that I'll give you, and it's land use compatibility near military bases, a planner's perspective. The challenge of the local planner is to understand the relationship between the local government and the local base and understand the nature of these specialized land use conflicts with military bases. The rural areas that used to surround most of the bases are now home to residential, commercial, industrial, other land uses, many of which are incompatible with safe military bases. I'm thinking about like Avon Park bombing range, where they started to have to get into this because the land use around it went from rural to starting to be developed. But these aspects that are happening outside the base, and you can see here's a military base and big high rises in the background, they can also undermine mission readiness by placing limits and constraints on operations. I had an early case in probably the late 1980s to early 1990s where I was the planner 2. I just started at DCA, so that'd probably be the 84 to 86 range. And I was the planner for the Panhandle, where we were starting to see all these big high rises get proposed in the Destin area. Now, I'm enough of a military brat that I realized that Eglin, with all their training they were trying to do, they had a need for over-the-horizon electronic look, and that building these high rises were going to greatly decrease and interfere with that over-the-horizon look from all their electronics. So I tried to raise this issue with the Eglin base commander, and at that time they were not very receptive to getting involved in anything that the local government or the state might be doing, so they just blew me off. About 15 years later to 20 years later, they were starting to scream about all this incompatible land use that was interfering with their over-the-horizon electronic capability, and they had to try to deal with it after the fact about how they were going to try to deal with it. So, you know, be careful what you ignore, I guess. From the military's perspective, the effects of incompatible land use on operations are just as real. Where conflicts are especially acute, the military may stop using certain runways, curtail nighttime operations, or limit low-level altitude training exercises. Citizen complaints and pressures from community leaders often precipitate these operational changes, often with regard for the long-term viability of the base. In some cases, the military base is the only economic driver in the whole area. That's the case, you know, that was the case for a long time with Eglin in the Panhandle. It was the big 800-pound gorilla of economic driver for the area. So what can planners do about that? Simply put, they must understand the various technical, planning, legal dynamics involved and promote ongoing military and local government coordination. And what's happened since I had this issue in the 80s was that the military finally decided there were real problems with land use compatibility around their military bases. So they set up a series of programs, which we're going to cover in a minute, to try to deal with that. So for military airports, the Air Force, Navy, and Navy rely upon the Air Installation Compatibility Use Zone, or ACUS program, to address land use compatibility. Okay. Although the military offers considerable background planning support, the fact remains that the only government that can implement the military's recommendations through comprehensive planning and land use regulations is the local government. Okay. For example, a land use element could address the issue of compatibility use by calling for implementation of either the AQs or the JUs. That's Joint Land Use Study. And that's used a lot for Army bases and things like that. Both transportation and public facility elements can help limit growth-inducing infrastructure near bases. With targeted comprehensive planning provisions in place, local governments can implement military land use regulations through land use or through the zoning ordinance. Typically, typical way they do it is have a military overlay zoning ordinance for the land use that's part of their comp plan, put in their zoning, and that has certain restrictions. It's an overlay that tries to restrict things, like they address the height, the noise, the accident potential zones contained in the base's AQ study, imposing specific land use regulations in addition to the property's underlying zoning regulation. For instance, underlying zoning a half mile from the end of a runway may allow residential uses, although an AQ's military overlay would likely prohibit residential dwellings due to an overarching accident potential and noise impacts. So there may be a difference, in what they're doing. In addition, military overlays often address light pollution, dust, glare, spectrum interference, certain ground activities that interfere with aircraft communications or radar systems. That was like the high rises in Destin. The 20-story building is going to go up along the coast. For example, wind turbines can interfere with radar by causing blackout zones or causing blades to be mistaken for other aircraft. Finally, military overlays often contain various procedural administrative functions, including coordination between local governments and the military with regard to development proposals, comprehensive plan amendments, and rezonings that could result in unnecessary conflicts. By adopting and enforcing these standards at the local level, land use conflicts can be avoided, reduced, in some cases eliminated. Experience shows that preparation of an AQ study or a joint JLU study is not enough, even though they're done in cooperation with the local government. Once these studies are completed, local governments must chart a course forward and craft a regulatory response that protects the base of the public, consistent with local values and the planning vision. This calls for evaluation of various authorized techniques and tools. And you want to do this as soon as possible so that the tools, otherwise the tools may not be accepted by the community for legal or political reasons. Any procedural requirements like comprehensive plan or amendments can be started, and affected property owners and stakeholders are put in notice that the regulation is pending, which may mitigate vested rights claims to incompatible land use once the overlay is adopted. Three main groups of stakeholders: military, the local government officials, and the public, especially property owners facing increased regulation. When competing interests and the need for community compromise is day-to-day for local government officials, this framework would be unfamiliar to military officials used to command and control environment. That was they didn't want to know, they didn't want to get involved in the DRI program, which is local government approval but state oversight, even though we tried to pull them into the process to allow them the opportunity to have their concerns expressed as and they didn't even want to express what those concerns might be. So much can be done to establish productive working relationships between the local government and the military. For example, if authorized, local government should designate a military office as a member, maybe as an ex officio member of the Planning Commission, or some other local board charged with development reviews and planning. The military and local governments need to work together. As neighbors, both sides have an interest in working to ensure land use compatibility. There are several legal issues that arise in the context of land use conflicts. So we're going to talk about notable legal issues for planners. The first one is, how do you terminate nonconformities? Existing non-conforming use. In the military compatibility context, there may be a greater need to be proactive. Given the nature of military overlay regulations, non-conforming uses can be significant. This may be, things like homes just off the runway. How do you amateurize them out? Okay. One of the most effective yet controversial ways for phasing out nonconformities is amortization. How much time must the property owner be afforded? Well, foundationally, courts require that the amortization period be reasonable. Now, in the case of, and typically it's based upon recouping their economic investment. So maybe for a single family home, it's going to be the time to the end of their mortgage. But few hard and fast rules exist, so each nonconformity may need to be handled on a case-by-case basis and sometimes in court. Moratoria. Several years of military and community planning typically precede the adoption of a military overlay. As would be expected, sometimes there's a rush to develop while plans are being formulated. To avoid this, local governments may consider adopting moratorium while plans and regulations are fleshed out. How long can you go? Well, you can see they bring up Tahoe. So, Tahoe was on and off for 32 months. In order to avoid taking, the court stressed that moratorium must both serve a valid purpose, such as planning in progress, and be of reasonable duration based upon the nature, scope, and complexity of the planning challenge. In a military land use compatibility context, a moratorium would likely be found to have a valid purpose because it restricts development while local government prepares a permanent plan to address public safety and military preparedness, both vital public interests. Additionally, moratorium must be limited in duration based upon the reasonable time to prepare, consider, and adopt the overlay. Moratoria of indefinite or undefined duration will almost certainly be struck down. And again, the one guidance is probably around the 32-month time frame in the Tahoe case. So conclusion, it can be an environment in which some planners and military officials are not comfortable. However, after a few face-to-face meetings, a little background on how the other party works, the well-intended objectives of the two groups typically can be addressed in a mutually agreeable solution reflecting the local values and the overarching planning mission of both entities. So that gives you a quick primer into JLUIS, ACCUSE, military-based compatibility, and some of the things you may have to worry about. All right. Going on to school siting and school planning. All right. This is a Journal of American Planning Association article on school siting that I found useful. It focuses in on a little bit on the history. One of the earliest guides was part of the regional plan of New York as environments. Well, where have we heard that before? That's where Clarence Perry came up with his neighborhood unit, which talked about placing the elementary school at the heart of the neighborhood unit and advocated for neighborhoods large enough to support one elementary school to protect neighborhood children from the dangers of the automobile in each neighborhood. He cited earlier suggestions that children should not be required to travel more than 1/2 mile to school. That's the classic 1/2 walking distance for an elementary school. Here gives you some size and some of the guidelines. I've marked the ones that I want you to try to remember because they're the ones that may come up. So minimum site size in acres for an elementary school, around 10 acres. These are minimum site sizes. Middle school, around 20 acres. High school, around 30 acres. Now, notice that there's a little A after each one of these 10, 20, 30, and that's a minimum acre plus 1 acre per 100 students of anticipated final enrollment. So if there were 200 students in an elementary school, then that would be 12 acres plus 1 acre per 100 anticipated final enrollment, okay? Obviously, Clarence Perry's model of the neighborhood affect many, many other areas. We've come across it many times. Here it is. They have the school playground area in the middle, the major arterial streets are on the outside, more curvilinear streets in the side. Density, we're going to cover the more specifics, but density around 10 units per acre, about 160 acres, and we'll get into populations. So that's just the schematic of a neighborhood unit. Okay, and other thing I want to do is get into travel a little bit. This is for elementary schools. What's the Walking distance, well, typical walking distance is about, these are the ones I really want you to remember down here, about 1/2 mile for elementary school, about 3/4 mile for a middle school, and about 1 mile for a high school. They can go a little higher, some go up to 2 miles. And then they have a walking, driving time, distance here, but these distances are more what I want you to remember. And that may be majority of what I want you from this one to pick up. But anyway, this is a whole discussion about school siting. Now, just to go back and remind you about neighborhood unit a little bit. Designed by Perry to act as a framework for urban planners to design functional, self-contained, desirable neighborhoods in the early 20th century in industrializing cities. Perry's concept of neighborhoods at the time were like islands locked amidst the burgeoning sea of vehicular travel, a dangerous obstacle which prevented children and adults from safely walking to nearby. So he published in the 1929 Regional Plan of New York and its environs, which led to promotion as a planning tool. And the criteria were, the principles were, first of all, here's that same basic picture, okay? Center of the school in the neighborhood so the children's walk to school was only about 1/4 mile to no more than 1/2 mile and could be achieved without crossing the major arterial streets. So all the arterials are on the outside. It was big enough to support a school. Between 5,000 and 9,000 residents. That issue has come up. How big a population do you need to support elementary school? Probably between 5,000 and 9,000. 160 acres has a density of 10 units per acre. Place arterial streets along the perimeter, the outside here. Eliminate unwanted through traffic by having curvilinear streets, smaller streets, things like that. Design internal streets using a hierarchy that easily distinguishes local streets from arterials, using curvilinear street design for both safety and aesthetics. Restrict shopping to the perimeter, so out here on the arterials, or perhaps the main entrance of the neighborhood, and dedicate at least 10% of neighborhood land to parks and open space. So some of these areas be parks and open space here. That's the neighborhood unit concept. That almost guarantee you that some aspect of this neighborhood unit concept will come up on the exam. And I'll just highlight this one also. Again, he published it in New York Regional Survey, Volume 7, 1929. That used to come up. I don't think it will anymore, but no, it's associated with Clarence Perry. No, it's a connection to school planning. All right. Next area we want to talk about a little bit. Library planning. Remember some of the questions were things like the first step of library planning. Okay. Well, just like in a lot of planning, conduct a self-assessment. Conduct a library planning self-assessment. Use results to begin planning the elements of the plan that need development or revision. Okay. And this goes through the rest of the steps. You can look through them so you know what the steps are, but they've been asking about the first one most of the time. Just to give you a couple other sources here. What is a plan? So you're going to look critically at what the library does now. By assessing the current situation, the obvious needs and direction can be identified. You have an assessment of the community needs, first responsibility to address the needs of the community. So you're going to do that. That's sort of your steps. So you're gathering information. Reviewing community needs for services includes cultural, educational, informational resources for the community, looking at demographics and economic data, identifying factors in the library's environment. Today, of course, increasingly, you're having a shift in libraries to a little bit to digital and a lot of access to digital type of stuff. So that may be part of that assessment. I'll add some resources that talk about newer stuff with libraries and digital looking because of the digital demands that they have. Here's another source. looks at, after he gets through all the references. Did I pass it? Yes, I passed it. Sorry, skipped over. Basic steps in a library building project. Okay, it takes about 3 to 4 years to complete once the planning begins in office. So they do things like getting it initiated, getting a committee going, selecting a library, consulting a librarian to deal with this. And by the way, typically they get a consulting librarian that knows about building new libraries or expanding it, because that's a form of art that more planners know about that librarians don't. So they within the field, the library field, they actually have people that are specializing in new library construction and that, so they pull them in. So one of the first things they do by here, the complete the library space needs assessment. Okay. And then they go on to do other stuff. Sometimes it's getting their goals, sometimes, but they look and do their assessment first. Okay. And it's just more discussion about how you go through that process. All right. Told you about trip generation may come up on the exam for libraries, which most of you probably never looked at, except when I picked it up the other day. So for a library, per 1,000 square feet of space, it's a trip generation of about 56.24. Now, if they were to ask you here, what's the dependent variable and what's the independent variable, what answer would you have? What would be what? What would be the independent variable? What's
Square
the
feet.
Square feet. Square footage would be the independent variable. So the dependent variable would be the number of trips per 1,000 square feet. Okay. I don't know what the question is going to be exactly, but they've been asking something about that. And I did get one indication sort of that it may be tied to knowing what the dependent variable was in the rate. I don't know if they give you the numbers or they ask you to remember that it's about 56. Okay. You can see it's lower than a daycare, but it's a lot higher than a lot of other uses per 1,000 square feet. For instance, let's see where we have, do we have office here? Yes, we have office down here. So for instance, it's higher than most office except for a governmental office building. This is Palm Beach County's trip generation, which is all based on, mostly based on ITE, International Traffic Engineering numbers. So it's got the land use category, it's got the land use type, what the independent variable is, per 1,000 square feet, what the rate is. So this is a government office, which is a little bit higher. And then it just has other things like passerby capture, what the AM peak hour is, and what the PM peak hour. Anyway, you'll have this table, and you can use it for the other discussion we're going to have tonight in transportation too. The last concept on libraries I want you to know is the library is the third place. The third place is a concept that was coined by Ray Oldenburg in his book, The Good Place. And a simple definition is that third places are neutral social surroundings, separate from home and work, school, that people can get together. Home is obviously the first place. Work or school is the second place. And this is where you can hang out and see a lot of different people, different ways. Some characteristics of the third place tends to involve regulars. In other words, if it's a bar or if it's a library, people tend to go there and go back to it and go back to it. It's free or inexpensive. In other words, to come in even to a bar, it doesn't cost you anything typically to get in. And you can hang out there and you can spend as little or as much as you want. Often, but not always, it offers food and drink. Obviously, a library doesn't necessarily, but at least have some water someplace. It's welcoming and comfortable, encouraging people to stay and return. It's destination of choice and often is a place where cultures mix. So low income, middle income, high income, they'll mix. This is true whether it's something like a bar or bowling alley or someplace like a library, wherever. There's a bunch of articles here about the public library, third place for teens. Big city libraries can take a page from their small town cousins about how to do it. Digital libraries is a third place, and I'll give you some stuff on digital libraries. Public libraries, local communities, libraries, third place. Anyway, so this is just a concept, and they've asked in the past questions about this third place. You saw there was somebody got a question on third place. Yes, here. 2 questions, one of which was the idea of third place, which I picked up, and it was associated with library stuff. So now you know what a third place is. It's another place you can go to socialize, typically and not feel threatened or intimidated. It goes across cultures, and a place you can sometimes have some fun at, And I just gave you 2 examples, but there's many others. All right. We're going to cover RLUIPA, which is a Religious Land Use Institutionalized Persons Act. I'm going to start on this 1 slide presentation, but then I'll take you over to someplace else that maybe defines it a little bit more crisper, but this is still a good introduction. Congress enacted RLUIPA in 2000 in response to Supreme Court finding that the earlier Religious Freedom Act was unconstitutional, and RLUIPA ended up being coming from the far left and from the far right. So I think it was Orrin Hatch and Teddy Kennedy got together, and Teddy wanted to try to protect particularly people in prisons for their religious, and Hatch wanted to have more general religious freedom type stuff. So the compromise was to get Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And because it affects with a fundamental right like religious freedom, it requires that strict scrutiny, if you remember from our law class, be used in free exercise classes involving land use and institutionalized persons. The general rule is this, and we'll further break it down later. No government shall impose or implement a land use regulation in a manner that imposes a substantial burden on religious exercise unless the government can demonstrate a compelling governmental interest that is the least restrictive means of furthering that interest. So this general rule applies when the substantial burden affects interstate commerce and when the substantial burden is imposed by a system of land use regulations that involve individualized assessment. The individualized assessment aspects include zoning regulations that allow for variance of special permits or conditional use permits. Some courts have found land use regulations to affect interstate commerce. But some of the things there's not a lot of definitions about. What is religious exercise? What is land use regulation? What is substantial burden? What is compelling governmental interest? And that's started to be fleshed out a little bit, as we'll talk about when we look at an APA document. And it's true that the facts of the case ultimately control the court's rulings. State courts have generally had a complete and total exclusion of religious activities within the city is problematic. That's a substantial burden. Federal courts have said, well, governmental action places substantial pressure on claimants that violate their beliefs or effectively bars from using the property. That may be, and even more so, it has to be, though, something more than an exclusion from a particular piece of property, but something less than total exclusion. So there's been back and forth, and we're going to get some things. And then this was an early slide set when this was first happening. So Fifth Circuit Court found that relevant inquiry is not whether government burdens religious freedom, but whether the region is substantially burdened a specific religious practice. And for instance, the denial of a church application for conditional use permit when it forecloses a church from any church use of its property, that's a problem. RLUIPA, however, does not provide religious institutions with immunity from land use regulations. In many cases, real property is used by religious institutions for purposes that are comparable to those being carried out by other institutions. This alone does not automatically bring those activities within RLUIPA's definition of religious exercise. RLUIPA does prohibit a government from totally excluding a religious assembly from the jurisdiction. So if you exclude all religious institutions, all synagogues, all churches, all mosques from your entire jurisdiction, that's a problem. Okay, that's all I wanted to do on this one. What I want to go into is we're going to cover one more first. Just to reiterate and go back over what it's about, it prohibits the imposition of burdens on the ability of prisoners to worship as they please, and gives churches and other religious institutions a way to avoid zoning restrictions on their property under certain circumstances. Okay. And usually it's a zoning land use, obviously, for the planners that comes up, not so much the prisoner. The general rule, again, is no government shall impose or implement a land use regulation in a manner that imposes a substantial burden on the religious exercise of a person, including a religious assembly or institution, unless the government can demonstrate that imposition of the burden on that person, assembly, or institution, A, is in furtherance of compelling governmental interest, and B, is the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling government interest. So it's a two-part test. All right, so let's look at some actual discussion on, again, from a zoning practice article, what constitutes a substantial burden under RLUIPA? RLUIPA cautions local governments not to substantially burden let me just check first, everybody, make sure everybody's. Cindy, I've unmuted you, so if you'd self-mute yourself. Derek, I've unmuted you, so if you'd self-mute yourself. Derek, I've unmuted you. There you go. Thanks. Heather, I've unmuted you, so if you'd self-mute yourself. Heather, if you'd self-mute yourself. Hassan, if you'd self-mute, there you go. Thanks. Heather, self-mute yourself, please. Okay. Irina, if you'd self-mute yourself. Irina, if you'd self-mute yourself, please. Tia, if you'd self-mute yourself, please. Okay, I think I've gotten everybody here. All right, so RLUIPA cautions local government not to substantially burden a religious land use applicant's right to free exercise, but provides little guidance about what actions might constitute a substantial burden. Religious land use applicant has the initial burden of demonstrating the land use is a substantial burden. But the local government then has the opportunity to explain what the compelling governmental interests exist and how the local government use the least restrictive means. Religious land use applications have prevailed in substantial burdens claims less than 25% of the time. Pretty good odds from the local government's point of view. So when have no substantial burden been found? One, when affirmations that general zoning and land use restrictions apply to everybody. These are things like having a minimum 1,000-foot buffer between non-agricultural, non-residential uses in an agricultural district to protect, preserve, enhance the rural character and lifestyle existing. If it applies to everybody equally, and it just happens to apply also to the churches, that's fine. It's applying as a general application, applies to everybody. Affirmation that churches may be excluded from some districts. In some cases, you can exclude churches or religious facilities from a particular area, like maybe a downtown area. Here's a case in Illinois. They purchased a warehouse, an industrial zone. The village said, nope, can't put it in there. That's restricted. They said the ban on the industrial zone cannot in itself constitute substantial burden, because then every zoning ordinance that didn't permit churches everywhere would be a prima facie violation of RLUIPA. So you can select, you have to make sure that they are acceptable certain places, but you can't even say a downtown area. And there's more detail on each one of these discussions on it. Affirmation that general review process that apply to everybody. Here's one in Orange County. They had that an application for a special district does not pose a substantial burden because it does not coerce conformity of the behavior. So, however, you have to be careful if you're saying that the special permit conditional use is only applies, say, to mosques and not to synagogues and not to churches. That would be highly problematic. So you have to be careful how you apply and that you're not separating them out and treating them differently. Okay. Now, where was substantial burden found? When there's multiple denials of a cooperative applicant, you have to be really careful. They give you an example here where they applied over and over and tried to meet everything that the local government wanted and still were getting denied. So they challenged it and they were found that no, you're being unreasonable. When delay, uncertainty, expense creates a substantial burden, similar type of case where they kept having to go through and through the process. It was just taking forever. And so they challenged it and they were found that that did substantially burden. Arbitrary blindness to the facts. Here's another one where it was a special permit and they wanted to renovate 2 older buildings, and the code allowed private schools to operate with a special permit. They wanted to, so that they wanted to hold the classrooms there, but there was a small but vocal opposition to the expansion project, and they just were treating them different than everybody else, and so they lost. Okay, does that give you a general idea of what RLUIPA is about and how it works? Okay. One of the last things here I wanted to touch about was there was that question that kept coming up about resilience applied to post-disaster hospital or first step for plans related to flooding hospitals in the area. I don't have a definitive answer, but I have what I think is an answer. Let me just get rid of that. And that is, I found several articles, but this is the easiest one to understand. Resilience is a prescription for healthcare facility planning. And they talking about all what happened with Katrina and the hospitals and Sandy and Maria and Harvey and all like that. And since Hurricane Sandy, resilience has emerged as a key issue in healthcare design or hospital design. What is resilience? It's basically the capacity of a system to recover from disruptive events, return to a prior state or trajectory. It applies to facilities, redundancies, processes, management, economics. In the built environment, reliance relates to how facilities are able to recover. And of course, they noted that the hospitals and clinic are an important part of the strength of communities. So they say, how do we deal with this? And the elements is resilience planning. The thing that they say is most important is location, location, location. Location was one of the most important issues for addressing responsiveness and reliability. For example, a hospital should be intelligently placed in a highly accessible area serviced by a broad range of transportation. They should be away from potential natural hazards that would leave them vulnerable to critical failure when they are needed most. Such areas include swamps, flood zones. So out of the high hazard zones, not in the velocity zones along the coast, up high enough that you're out of the 100-year floodplain. Maybe you're even in the 500-year floodplain. So the first thing to do is not even locate them in places where they're going to be affected. Then you get into other issues about design of facilities. You can deal with the transportation going there and the utilities and having backups and all the other things, okay? But just as you think, probably the first thing is don't put them in harm's way in an area that's had repeated hits or that is likely to be impacted by another. Now, you can't conceive of everything, but you can conceive of the normal, typical natural disasters like sea level rise and hurricanes and flooding and maybe even fire. You may not be able to plan for a tornado, but you may be in terms of location, but you may be able to just make it structurally sound enough to deal with that, have its own independent power supply and other needed aspects. Okay? Okay. So let's see what we're down to. Okay, so now we got some time. We're going to try to do a few practice questions. Anybody got any questions up to now? Yes, no, 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 no. All right, I didn't put this one down far enough. But anyway, noise contour of 85 decibels would be considered normal for what?
C, cat.
Yep, showed you that one. City traffic inside a car. Okay. Breathing levels about 10 decibels. Quiet residence about 40. A rock concert would be about 132. Levels above 70 dB, the level of freeway traffic become annoying. Levels above about 120 decibels, loud thunderclap would be painful. Okay, Johnson County is proposing to develop a major new airport near the Johnsonville city limits. You are in charge of revising the city's comprehensive plan to address airport safety and compatibility uses. The typical incompatibility uses near the end of the airport's new runway would be which ones?
C is in cat.
C is in cat. It would include the golf courses. It would not only be the structural things, but it would be their recreational use. Okay.
So why not D? Why wouldn't we include mowed grasslands?
Well, mowed grasslands are typically just going to be a grassland. They're not going to have any structures. They're not going to typically have people.
But that's the thing. I thought what's the point of putting mowed? Means that they're maintained, which means there's people.
Well, they may be maintained because they may be for other reasons to try to so you do mowing to try to prevent trees from growing in grasslands. It's a non-fire. If in areas where you want to control woody plants by fire control, by fire maintenance, but you can't do it like the end of a runway. You may do it by mowing them. Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense why there's people on it, but I'm just saying.
No, there wouldn't even be people on this. This would be like a pasture, and you wanted the pasture can go through a series of ecological stages, going into woody shrubs and then into trees. And to try to prevent that, you may not be able to do fire control, but you may be able to mow the areas to try to keep them open. Okay. And so you maintain it as a grassland, but you don't allow that, and that takes away the possibility that it will transition into woody plants and then the shrubs and things like that, and then into trees. Okay. You may be keeping it open because maybe you have cattle that graze there. The cattle are okay to graze there. They're not typically agricultural, even cattle are not considered a big deal. The only thing you'd have to be concerned about maintaining it as a grassland is whether or not it attracts large flocks of birds for any reason, whether there's something there that comes in the bird maintenance. But if you get into the past report that I'll attach, the Planners and Plains Airport and Land Use Compatibility, they'll talk more about this. Do you want me to open it up now? We can look at it if you want.
No.
Okay. Keep going. But that's some of the rationale.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. If you don't like the question, you can blame it on me because this is definitely one of my questions. Here's another. An outside noise exposure of 85 decibels would be considered normal for
B.
So industrial property, they say an airport. 85 decibels is about what an airport's doing it. Adjacent to a school would probably be a little quieter. Remember that the airport contours that you're trying to keep the noise around the air is at 65 dB, so inside it's going to be 85 or maybe even above that. But even though it's an industrial property, if it's adjacent to a school, you probably want it more like 40, 50, maybe 60 at most, because you want it to be fairly quiet around the school. You don't want it to be as noisy as an airport is around the school. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Noise contours are usually associated with analysis of impacts from.
A, apple.
I heard A as an apple, D as in dog, maybe I thought I heard.
Yeah.
It's going to be D as in dog. It's going to be A and C. Noise contours are something typically with the aviation planning, both airports and heliports. Okay,
Henry,
yes.
for previous question, for privately owned heliports, like in the residential areas, they're not usually noise contour.
You're
Are
saying
they?
they don't? I don't. I
Private.
would assume that I don't know if we have an aviation planner here or someone that deals with this issue, but I would assume that even a heliport like that's at Mar-a-Lago, at Trump's home, that when they put that heliport in, I would assume that they would have had done a noise contour around it to look at what it was going to be. Do you want me to look?
Yes, please. Thank you.
That question is not mine. But okay, so it looks like airport or heliport, they have to do an integrated noise model. Okay. I would assume that both are going to have to do it. I'll take a look real quick. If I can't find it, then I'll go on. Private sector, that's the only place private. I think it just generally deals with all heliport, but I can maybe send an email to Deborah and ask her. Where am I? Over here. All right. That was a Mike Wages question. 43. Some of you have seen this question before, but we touched on it today a little bit. And when in doubt, even if you fall back on your planning experience on the order of how you do things.
Yeah,
B as in boy.
C for Charlie.
C
So I
for
heard-
cat.
So I heard C for cat. So let's see what C for cat is. Moratorium. Yes, you do that first because you've got a safety issue here right away. So you go in and put a moratorium on, you do planning. Then you'd go through the planning process, the AQs, JLUS. Okay, you do that. And then you do hopefully adopt a military overlay adoption. And then as a last resort, if you still had problems to try to get them out of there as a existing non-conforming use, you'd amateurize whatever those uses are off the ends of the runways, whether they're residential or whatever. So yes. This is a question about the immediateness of action and order of action in the military land use compatibility context. A moratorium might likely be used to serve a valid public purpose, for instance, planning in progress, because it restricts development while local government prepares a permanent plan to address public safety and military readiness, both vital public interests. The planning process could happen either through the airfield-oriented Air Installation Compatible Use Zone, AQS process, or a Joint Land Use Study, JLUS, involving the military base, local government, and the public. For example, a comprehensive plan land use amendment might address the issue of compatible use by calling for implementation of the AQ study or the JLUS, which might be codified through the adoption of a military overlay addressing the height, noise, accident potential zones contained in the base AQ study, and imposing specific land use regulations in addition to a property's underlying zoning designation. Finally, a local government might use amortization to provide a non-conforming use property owner a reasonable time to phase out non-conforming uses and structures that interfere with military operations, but once that time has expired, the non-conformity would have to be terminated. And that comes from the source we just looked at a little bit, from the APA's compatibility land use near military bases, the zoning practice article. And that obviously I created the question, so. Okay, here's a little more fun one that gets, this is indirectly getting to a topic that we covered. Superblock is a concept most often associated with
B.
It's all of them, right? And Clarence Perry's neighborhood unit, which we talked about, has superblocks as those outside big arterials. So 1929, Clarence Perry developed a neighborhood unit plan in response to the advent of the automobile, and was also an attempt to identify local communities as a separate entity with its own qualities and needs. The neighborhood unit was to be distinct enclave, separate from the rest of the city. Perry's idea was to create homogeneous superblocks separating vehicular and pedestrian traffic, providing ample open space, and developing community life around the neighborhood school. Perry's concept was the basis for the development of the widely acclaimed plan for Radburn, which incorporated Perry's concepts, the superblock interior park, higher density clustering near the parkland, and hierarchical traffic separation. Le Cavoisier's The Radiant City envisioned the city laid out in a near perfect grid of superblocks, which became the basis for much of the public housing projects later built in the United States. Obviously, another one of my questions. All right, a little longer question. You're the planner for the city of Aurora, Illinois. The planning department has worked closely with the school district in completing a project. Let me just push this down into the next, make it a little easier to read it. Closely with about completing a project of school-age children to the year 2020 based upon current zoning. You were on the team, and in fact, you did a lot of the input for the cohort survival method technique. So this is a school, but goes across areas. So this is a school question, goes across some of the census demographic population projection that we did. I'll let you read the rest. This one's a little tricky.
A for apple.
A for apple. You'd recommend development is approved based upon the probability of less school-age children with this type of development. Why do you say there's less?
and that older generation people, they may not have kids. So,
Well, or younger. It's going to be, the multifamily is going to typically not have as many kids per unit by anything close to what single family is. All right. So the answer is A. From the information provided, the fears of the school district for an increase in school-age children may not be as negatively affected by the proposal. In fact, one could argue that development would actually be a benefit to the school district. The reason being that historically across the nation, the number of school-age children created as a result of new multifamily residential is less than the number created by single-family homes. Now, of course, you don't know how many exactly what the number is, but based upon the information we know, the number of school-age children would be expected to be less. The planner should continue to explore the density being proposed to make sure there would actually be more children at the end of the day. All right. The carrying capacity of the existing school facilities would be expected to remain the same, if not better. Based on the facts given, this would be recommended for approval. Would not actually. This reads better, that not actually. Does that everybody understand that? Think about who lives in multifamily versus single family. All right. Okay. Give you an easy one. United States, the neighborhood unit concept is attributed to
B as in boy.
B.
Lawrence Perry, right? Lived in Forest Hill Gardens and published an essay on the concept in 1929. Forest Hill Gardens, which was developed by Frederick Lomstead Jr., inspired the neighborhood unit concept. Perry defined the neighborhood as a self-contained area with a 5-minute walking radius, bounded by major streets with shops at the intersection and a school in the middle. The other things there, other people, Kevin Lynch wrote Image of the City, Ian McCard wrote Design with Nature, and Lewis Mumford wrote Culture of Cities. Which of the following facility types are increasingly being shared to reduce costs?
B as in boy.
These and dog school recreation facilities, all right? Budget constraints and desires to use public facilities more efficiently are leading to more shared agreements for coordinating the use of schools and recreation facilities. So the park department often is getting with, and I know I've got one nearby where the high school has a gym, and during much of the day and during weekends, the gym is open for as a part of the park system for recreational use for adults. It's only closed at those times where students might be using it. As a rule, an elementary school should be blank from the population it serves.
B.
Half mile, right? We saw that. This was a little trickier. Traditionally, the acreage needed for a new high school has been which of the following?
See?
C as in cat.
30 acres plus 1 acre per every 100 students. Right. Yes, somebody have a comment?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it for 1 acre for each 100 students additional to what they start with?
No, you're going to build, this is a new high school.
Mm-hmm.
New high school. So if you're going to design a new high school, and there are upper limits also, but if you're going to have a new high school, and let's say it's going to be for 500, then you'd have 30 acres plus 5 acres, so should be around 35 acres.
Okay, thank you.
There are upper limits though, typically around 43 to 48 acres, according to that article that we looked at earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how you do it. So this is designing a new high school. So, and these are the standard classic, as people develop new models, they may massage this, but these are long-standing numbers.
Thank you.
Okay. down where we can see the whole question. Your fast-growing county has completed a major revision to your general plan, including a new capital improvements program. The new CIP would likely address.
C as in cat.
Land purchases and concurrency, but not the same time frame as the budget, and it doesn't include library books. All right. C as in cat. So the CIP is typically 5 to 6 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Realize that schools, one thing I did mention, realize that the standard around the country is that new school plans are often developed by the school board or the state Department of Education, and not as much, and often they're not even approved by the local government. So, and typically there's special funding for schools that comes from the state legislature. Okay, just think about how it works in Florida. If you're in Florida, you know, the siting of a school is to some degree out of the control of the local government.
Henry,
Yes.
is that the point you just made? I apologize if I asked this before, but it's not related to home rule versus Dillon's rule at all. Just is it, or is it not?
No, it's not. It's
in
not.
terms of whether you're BOE.
Well,
Okay.
it's not. In essence, I mean, there's some relationship, because if the state government says that the local government can have total home rule, including the right to even approve schools, fine. But usually they preempt local government regulation of schools. Okay, because at school, typically the provision of schools is a state mandated, state type of required provision that has to happen. Therefore, a lot of state money is often involved. There may be a tax base that goes to it locally, but it depends a little bit state to state. That's the best I can tell you.
Do we need to know anything about the federal regulation of schools?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Department of Education.
Like I say, the type of questions that have come up on schools have been I don't know what that is. I don't know. It's not open. I don't know what happened. All right. Going back to our questions here.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are schools considered special districts?
They are basically, well, let's see. They're not technically a special district in Florida. Okay. So we have a list of what are considered to be special districts, and each school district is not on that list. So they are a district, but they're not a special district in the sense that they typically don't raise their own ad valorem tax, I don't think. But I know they're not on the state special district list. Whether that's the case in, okay, well, let's just see if there's a general answer for this. Well, they are independent, special purpose local governments. That sort of qualifies as what a special district is. This is a special district. It's not saying schools, are schools. Let me see if it says anything about schools in the special district thing here. Yes, it's not found at all in that.
Oh, there was actually something that says that it excludes school districts.
Yeah, the header.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't see it, but I mean, I've always thought of them as separate. The term special district governments excludes school districts as they are defined as separate governmental type in general. Okay.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
117. You are the director for a regional planning agency, and you have a significant number of jobs in the education, training, and library sector. So they want to know about what's your area's economic strength. One way to do that is an educational location quotient. So this is going across areas again. I don't know why that one's a different text size.
B for boy.
B for boy, yes. Let me just get this one to the same text size. So B for boy, because it's the industry you're concerned about locally or regionally over the total regional employment, over the larger area employment in that same industry, over the total employment in the state. Okay, so it's educational services regional employment over total regional employment, over education services state employment, over total state employment. That's the location quotient. Okay. You plan a new library facility, it's important to know which of the following.
D as in dog.
D as in dog, all of those, yes. All of those are important. Now, which of the following data is the most important to have when planning a new library?
I do D again.
Now, this says most important to have. I'd say it's going to, there. This is my question. He's going to say C, the population to be served. Most important criterion is population. Because the population is everything else. If it's a population of 5, that greatly defines what the kind and level of service you're going to provide, what the range and the goals and objectives are. So the population, if it's 5 or 500 or 5,000, makes a big difference in terms of the other things. So that's why it's most important. All right. RLUIPA typically restricts the following local regulations.
A for apple.
All but building permits. Okay, it can be a restriction on zoning, it can be a restriction on conditional use permits, and a restriction on land use, but it's not going to restrict the building permits. Okay. Religious land use is a federal law that prohibits the impositions of burdens on the ability of prisoners to worship and gives churches a way to avoid burdensome zoning and land use regulations. We've read what's underlined. Courts have generally upheld general zoning and land use regulations that apply to everybody, like parking and traffic impact, and that churches may be excluded from some districts, like central business districts, and that religious institutions need to comply with building codes, and general review processes that apply to equally are typically not legally problematic. Although special permits and conditional use that single out and solely address religious uses can be problematic. So the best answer there is it's not going to really ever restrict anything on a building permit, but it can be, RLUIPA won't, but it may be a restriction on your zoning, it may be a restriction on your conditional use permits, and it may be a restriction on your land uses that are allowable. All right, with that, I think we may have a few more questions, but I'll do this last one. $112, and then I'm going to go on.
Do you like dog?
Do you like dog? Okay. All right. With that, I'm going to stop and go on. Transportation. And all right, so some of the transportation stuff that came in the fall was things like, what's the best way to slow traffic in an arterial street? What type of transportation demand method is the most effective? TOD, trip generation, distribution supply, assignment, putting them in order, level of service, transportation system management, transportation demand management. They had a figure on the difference. Somehow you had to interpret stuff on VMT versus VHT. Okay, vehicle miles traveled and vehicle hours traveled. All right. Questions on gravity model, purposes of MPOs, best way to keep pedestrians safe on arterial road. Questions about high-speed rail access to report parking cash-out program, chicanes, Woolners, who does air quality, who was involved with TOD, ICE-T, these are just some of the types of things. Red wave functional classification. So look through all the list. I've just marked a few of them out. All right. All right. Usually we have Peter Buchwald being able, he's the TPO director up in St. Lucie, Transportation Planning Organization, which is an MPO organization type. But I've taken that, done a little bit of modification, a couple little places. So we're talking about transportation planning, identifies current and future transportation issues, develops solutions to address those issues. Both looks at current and then tries to do projections for the future. Where should we put new roads? What's going to happen? Where's the land use is going to be? And then, of course, we can get into multimodal, different modes of travel. You can see biking here and trolley car and walking and cars. So you have 4 multimodal right there alone. Moving people, raw materials, goods to where they need to go most effectively and considering all modes of travel. People need to move, you know, for living, for working, learning, consuming, worshiping, playing, and raw goods need to move, you know, from their origin to intermediate to final destination. So all of those things involve transportation planning. Some of the inputs and tools, data and projections, using geographic information systems to try to help us model and figure out where things are going to go and how it's going to happen. Doing travel demand models, what area is producing trips, what area is attracting trips, stakeholder and public input and comments, getting that all involved. So it happens at you know, the federal level, the regional state level, and the local level. So at the federal level, you got U.S. Department of Transportation, Under that umbrella, you've got Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, Federal Railroad Administration, and Federal Aviation Administration, all coming into play in transportation. You have state departments of transportation, like we have the Florida Department of Transportation. And underneath that, you have a subset of metropolitan planning organizations that do typically a less than state regional size planning. And you may have council of governments that may act as the MPO, or you may have in some states regional planning councils that act as the MPO. We just have separate MPOs. We don't have council of governments, and our RPCs have other functions. Although they do play some role in transportation, but they're not the MPO. Which the MPOs are specifically required by federal legislation. We'll cover that a little bit later. And then, of course, at the local level, you may have local governments, either at the county level or municipal level. And as part of them, you may have transit or agencies, expressway agency, port authorities, airport authorities, and then finally you've got the public. Those are the different stakeholders all involved in this process. Yes.
Excuse me, on that regional, on those regional types. Should we know the difference between those 4 different types of regional organizations?
Well, you know what a state department of transportation is, right? The other 3 are all associated with what may be how an MPO may be organized. You may have a separate MPO, like we do in Florida here, or you may have a council of governments, which is like a regional planning council, but made up of government elected officials that functions as the MPO. Or you may have in some states a regional planning council that functions as an MPO. So yes, you need to know what a regional planning council is, you need to know what a council of government is, and you need to know what MPOs are.
May I ask a real world example? Of a regional transportation planning council. If all the cities that were affected by the FEC, for example, and I'm not trying to totally digress, but maybe you just have a singular answer, were to get together and try to form like some sort of group where they could lobby or whatever to, create a local rail system on the eastern southeast Florida. What type of organization would they potentially form? Would that, I'm sure there's a multitude of answers maybe, but if they were to get together, ideally, how would that work, or what type of council would they form?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your total answer, because there are, I'm trying to get this map to work here and I can't.
If the municipalities were to get together and just like work together and just say, hey, let's tackle this FEC thing and work together.
Yeah, but there's other things that come into play. The Federal Railroad Administration, you have, for instance, if you start talking about railroad stuff, you get Federal Railroad Administration. You may get some planning at the MPO level, but the MPOs don't cover the whole state. For instance, I can't move this.
Well, what if between like West Palm and Miami, just the cities were to get together, it formed like a new.
See where the green is here? Those are the areas covered by MPOs. So there's parts of the state that aren't covered by MPOs. All right. And if you did something with railroad stuff, you're going to have to involve the state, the feds anyway. So they can't just sort of do it by themselves, if that's the question.
Can they form an RPC? Like, can they?
That requires state legislation. RPCs in Florida, for instance, are dictated by state statute, and the state can add or do away with them. A few years ago, the state got pissed off at one of the RPCs and eliminated it. So they went from 11 RPCs to 10 RPCs.
If they had referenda, in theory, maybe they could lobby and create a new one.
It was not a referendum. This was state statute. RPCs in Florida cannot be formed by referenda. They're formed by state statute.
But can the legislature within the statute form a new RPC?
Yeah, that's they can do whatever they want. They created the current 10. There were 11. They destroyed one of them. They tore it apart and put its pieces into other RPCs, so the state legislature
So
can
they-
do what it wants.
So in theory, people could lobby their state legislator to create a new RPC. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I just
Okay.
wanted to just sort of thank you. I
Sure.
appreciate that. Thank you.
And people have done that, and they've been mostly unsuccessful.
You never know.
Okay, all right. So the federal agencies, what do they do? Well, they provide funding. They oversee the planning and project activities of MPOs and the state DOTs. They provide advice and training, and they provide environmental approvals on different permits and things like that. State Department of Transportations, they receive federal funding. They develop statewide transportation goals, plans, and projects. They are subject to certain federal requirements. They have to cooperate or consult with the MPOs, and in those states that have them, the Council of Governments that act as MPOs, and their local governments. They have to do a statewide transportation plan. They have to address air quality issues as part of the transportation planning and that goes in with MPOs, and they have to deal with environmental protection. So that's what issues for roadways and things like that. So state DOTs get involved in all of that stuff. The MPOs themselves, or if they're a council of government, or if they're a regional planning council, first of all, there's a federal mandate that you have to have a federally designated planning agencies for urbanized areas that are greater than 50,000 population. That has to be an MPO, or it can be a council of government or a regional planning council if they take on the role of what a metropolitan planning organization does. They have to be governed by a board of local elected and agency modal reps, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They have to be subject to the federal requirements for the 3C planning process, that is continuing, cooperative, comprehensive. The continuing means maintains planning as an ongoing activity that addresses both short-term needs and long-term vision for the region. Cooperative means involves a wide variety of interested parties through public participation process. And comprehensive means it covers all transportation modes and is consistent with regional and local land use plans. And the MPO may also have the authority to plan and regulate local land use, but typically they don't. There are a few places in the country where they do, but that's typically something they do not do as a general form of art. Local governments, what do they do? Well, in terms of transportation, well, they provide the local funding for projects, particularly projects that are, county road this or, the city street or whatever. They develop local transportation priorities and plans. They engage in regional planning that's done with the MPOs, if they have one, with regional planning councils and state transportation planning. They identify the impacts of new development. They identify and schedule improvements, and they maintain local infrastructure, and of course they approve land uses. Transit agencies and expressway, port authorities, airport authorities, well, they operate public transportation options of the type that they're set up to do, whether it's transit or whether it's expressway, whether it's a port, or whether it's an airport. They receive different subsidies and generate revenue. They develop system plans. They implement and construct projects for their type of transportation, and they coordinate on regional planning activities. So some of the history of transportation planning and federal legislation goes all the way back to 1916, the first Federal Aid Road Act, which had the first federal highway funding in it. Next major one was 1921, the Federal Aid Highway Act, which helped develop the national highway system, all the U.S. highways, things like that. But the big one that seems to come up on the exam the most is probably the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act, also known as the Highway Defense Act. So that a little more a complicated name than that, but National Highway Defense Act, and established the interstate highway system. President Eisenhower was the mover behind it, and it helped create 41,000 miles of interstate highway. 1962 Highway Act established the metropolitan planning organizations and the requirements that the urbanized areas greater than 50,000. And while it did that, it established the 3C process, the continuing cooperative comprehensive and cooperative, which sometimes comes up on the exam. And then next major act was 73, Highway Safety Improvement Program, and did funding for mass transit projects. So started mass transit funding, really. Then other ones that come up sometimes is the 1991 ICE-T, Intermodal Service Transportation Efficiency Act. And that's where you got the enhancement in transportation systems, where you started to deal with congestion mitigation and air quality. The CMAQ program, you started to see some fiscal constraints come into play, though, and you started to get into social equity issues. Equal emphasis to all modes of transportation, including public transit, biking, and walking, and where you started to get funding for like the walking lanes and things like that. The T21 program in 1998 did more focus on congestion management system and established earmarks for transportation projects, so you could have particular earmarks for particular locales. 2005, Safe Accountability, Flexible, Efficient Transportation Equity Act, called Safety Lou. It was renowned for its establishing the Safe Routes to School program. The 2012, Moving Ahead for Progress in 21st Century, MAP 21. It was a short-term 2-year reauthorization for $52 billion a year. See, we got a little typo there. But it went and eliminated the earmarks because they were getting misused. It consolidated a number of programs, and it started to establish use of performance measures for programs that they had to address. And then 2015, the FAST, the Fixing America's Service Transportation. It was a 5-year reauthorization at $56 billion per year. It continued some of the MAP 21 provisions, established a national freight program, and then started to accelerate project delivery for some of the infrastructure that it was doing. So those are some of the acts, some of the funding sources. The federal government has a highway trust fund and a general fund that takes money from and passes that down, a large portion of it, to states to implement. States have their own trust fund, general fund, and they can use bonds. And increasingly, we're getting toll roads with bond funding, things like that. Local funds, usually a local option fuel tax and sales tax. They can do impact mobility fees, sort of like congestion pricing that like Miami-Dade is starting to do, and we'll probably have up in this area, in Palm Beach at some point. They can use their general fund money, bond money, or they can, for some things, use transit fare box revenues. Say MPOs. The board composition of MPOs, it comprised of local government reps, transit operator reps, State Department of Transportation reps, Expressway Aviation Port Authority reps, and then other transportation providers such as school boards. You know, all those little yellow buses out there, they have a lot of transportation involvement and concerns about what's going on in the transportation system. The MPO's responsibility, they have a responsibility to do a long-range transportation plan, which may be called the Metropolitan Transportation Plan in some jurisdictions. They have to do a transportation improvement program. They have to do a United Planning Work Program along with the other organizations, and they have to get into congestion management process, and they have to deal with Title VI, civil rights issues, and environmental justice issues. Title VI is no person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefit of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And of course, that includes all the transportation funding for all the different modes that are being used. So you can have a Title VI claim if you're denied access to any of those transportation aspects on the grounds of race, color, national origin. Environmental justice, basically out of President Clinton's Executive Order 12898, which that number has come up on the exam from time to time. Each federal agency shall make achieving environmental justice part of its mission. This is usually done through NEPA, by identifying and addressing as appropriate where you have disproportionate high and adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies, activities on minority populations and low-income populations. So this means that even when we do, when we did environmental justice, I showed you that even when we do projects like Everglades restoration and we do it down in Miami-Dade, even though portions of that are majority Hispanic areas, we have to assess whether Hispanic is one of the defined minority populations, whether we're having a disproportionate high and adverse human health or environmental impact on their activities, because some of the funding for Everglades restoration, half of it is matched by the federal government. All right, MPO responsibilities continue. Other things they get involved with, of course, they have to allow public involvement early and often through some of their activities. They get into transit planning, they get into bicycle pedestrian planning, they get in regional coordination, often with the cities that have regional agreements for transportation. They get into air quality planning and conformity. Remember, this has come up on the exam. You know, what are the roles of the MPO? What do they deal with? And one of the things they deal with is air quality. And this is whether or not you're in compliance with the air quality standards or whether you're a non-conforming area. What does a non-conforming area mean? In this sense, it means that you have automobile pollution or rail or truck that is causing the violation of the air quality standards set under the Clean Air Act, and therefore you're a non-attainment area. And non-attainment areas, the state has to work with them to come up with a state implementation plan about how to get them back into attainment. And that plan is prepared by the state, but it's approved by the federal government. Okay. They obviously, MPOs will also get environmental reviews, including NEPA reviews, and they'll do travel demand forecasting modeling, which we'll cover in a little bit. And they get into performance-based planning. So, environmental analysis. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, NEPA, enunciated for the first time a broad national policy to prevent or eliminate damage to the environment. Environmental impact analysis must be performed for any project receiving federal funds, and you're required to proceed with right-of-way acquisition and construction. But all alternatives consistent with the objective of each project must be evaluated, include the do-nothing option, to find the best transportation solution that helps preserve and protect the value of environmental and community resources. Okay, going on to travel demand forecasting model. The four-step, or what's known as the gravity model. All right. They've asked you these steps in order, okay, on the exam sometimes. The first step is trip generation. That's you're estimating the number of trips that are generated by different types of land use. So like you take an area, typically you do this by traffic analysis zones, and you say, okay, this area is all residential. So here's how many units are in here, how many trips are going to be generated per day from this area. Then you're going to say trip distribution. Where are those trips going to go? Well, 20% of them are going to go to school, 70% are going to go to work, 10% of them are going to go to other, such as retail or other things. So, you know, they're going to go different places. So they're going to, each trip is going to have two trip ends. It's going to have an origin and destination. And then you're going to say, okay, now that you've done it that way, well, how are they going to split out in terms of different modes of traffic? Maybe 5% of those, or maybe 50% of those going to school are doing it by walking. Okay. And maybe 20% of those going to school are doing it by bus. And then the rest are going by car. Okay. Or by bike. Those are all different modes. So estimates which trips will use automobiles and which will use other modes, transit, bicycling, and walking. Then you're going to say, okay, now which routes are they going to use to get to that destination. Are they going to go out at this big major road? Are they going to go on this back road? So that's with network assignment, assigning the trips by each mode to the roadway network. And then once you've done that for all of your different areas, then you start to have an idea on which roads are being impacted at what degree, how they're working compared to the established level of service on that road. So travel demand forecasting modeling continued. You can have activity-based models also. It factors in how people make travel decisions, whether to travel, where to travel, when to travel, how to travel. And as person level considerations, interactions, connections through the day, the demographics, who does it? It's the younger folks, the older folks, and what's the time that's involved doing it. Okay. Performance-based planning, this is target setting, performance measures, and reporting. So the federal requirements are looking at infrastructure, what the pavement conditions are, what the bridge conditions are, safety issues, how many serious injuries you had, how many fatalities you had, mobility, what's been your traffic congestion, how is your freight moving, transit, how has been safety, or the state of good repair or not, air quality, have you been having a lot of travel delays and therefore having more air pollution put in a particular area, and then how well have you been doing on emissions reduction. So that's performance-based planning. What MPOs do not do, they don't maintain the roads, they don't operate the roads, they don't construct the roads, they don't design the roads. Okay? That's more typically done by your state or local departments of transportation. Traffic analysis. Okay, you need to know this table a little bit, have a general sense for it, for what the different levels of service are. Sometimes they'll ask you one of these definitions and ask you what level of service it is, or they'll ask you the level of service and say which definition does it match up with. So level of service A, you're doing great. Free flow, low volumes, high speeds on the roadway. Level of service B, well, you're stable flow. You have operating speeds just beginning to be a little bit restricted by traffic. And the drivers basically have a reasonable freedom to select their speed and the lane of their operation if they have multiple lanes. Level of service C, this is mostly stable flow, but speeds and maneuverability are somewhat closely constricted by the higher volumes, or more closely constricted by the higher volumes. Level of service D, approaching unstable flow. Approaching unstable flow. With tolerable operating speeds, but driving speed can be considerably affected by changes in operating conditions. Level of service E can't be described by speed alone. You're approaching capacity. Okay, operating speeds are lower than in level of service D with volume at or near the capacity of the roadway. You're near the capacity, level of service E. Level of service F, operating speeds are stop and go. The stoppage disrupts the traffic so that the volume carried by the roadway falls below its capacity. Without the stoppage, the volumes would be higher and it would be reach capacity. Basically, your V over C ratio, your volume to capacity of the roadway, is greater than 1. So the volume on the roadway is greater than the capacity of the roadway to deal with it. So you need to know those general gradations and what the general terminologies are. They particularly like to ask E, D, or B, but know all of them because they could ask it. And here's what they look like. This is based on average daily traffic to capacity. You look at the V to C ratio, volume to capacity ratio. Level of service is somewhat aspect of that. So here's free flow, low density of traffic, easy to change whatever lanes you want to go to. Level of service B, delays, not unreasonable, stable flow. Level of service C, somewhat stable conditions, a little higher volumes. There's some restrictions. You can't move lanes as easily as you'd like to move lanes. D, your movement is more restricted, more traffic here. Speed may be compromised. Level of service E, you're approaching capacity. You have delays, all different directions. And then F, you're having your volume is greater than the road can really deal with. You've got congestion. You may have stop and go, multiple times to go through the intersection at a signalized intersection. Now, they started to try to do this for other types of modes also. So here's the general A, B, C, D, E, F for automobiles. Here's sort of a general look at what it means for bicycles. Okay, bicycles is more about safety issues too. You can see this is a much better situation than this and much better than that one. Pedestrians, the same sort of thing, where you get down to where you don't even have a sidewalk. Okay, and buses, how many per hour that goes. You start looking at, you have less than one bus per hour that comes by. That's like level service F of the bus. If you have like 4 buses per hour, that's A or B level service. These are just generic. So traffic impact analysis. Understanding demands placed on the community's transportation network by development. The goal is to forecast additional traffic associated with new development based on accepted practices. And you try to determine the improvements that are necessary to accommodate that new development. And of course, this assists communities in land use decision. And if you have issues like if you have adequate public facility ordinances or concurrency like Florida, you may have restrictions on land use based on whether or not you have adequate capacity in the roads. Large communities in particular will need to determine appropriate mixes of transportation modes, including public transit options. This is something we got into a little bit with the large developments in Florida, developments of regional impact, but for the most part, local governments were resistant to trying to deal with transit issues as part of the DRI approvals. Here's a table of your generation rates. So you can use this one and the other one we gave you for when we did library stuff. And you can see these are single family homes. You can see that single family homes are the greatest generator on a daily. There are almost 10. The only one that comes up there is condos and townhouses. They can actually have higher trip generation rate. Where's my cursor? And then it goes down with recreational homes being sort of the lowest. Shopping centers versus discount restaurants. You can see a high turnover restaurant has a much higher, and then convenience stores like a convenience mart with gas pumps has a much higher. You got lots of cars that go in and out of that, as does a convenience market that runs 24 hours. And you can see some of them are per gross floor area, gross leasable area, or per employee, or so on and so on. All right, this just gives you an idea. All 3 pictures are accommodating the same number of people. If you took the people out of the cars, here's how they'd be dispersed here. So they're taking all the roadway capacity in. If you put them in a bus, all those people would fit in one bus, so there'd be a lot less transportation impact on the roads. And if you put them in things like bikes, they'd have a lot less also. And bikes and walking, they'd have a lot less impact on the roadway system. Traffic analysis zones. These are often the zones that are used for traffic analysis modeling. And the TAZ is typically used in transportation modeling. It's delineated by local and state agencies. It's based on census tracts and census blocks. And it's further refined according to geographic boundaries and major roadways. And they're typically identified by a number like this. And this just takes our area here, and he shows you where the TAZs are. Obviously, TAZs are out in the rural areas where nobody lives, are much larger, and they get smaller based on census tracts and blocks. So you'd look at, for each one of these, you'd have a TAZ that would be sending people out someplace and attracting other trips to it. Roadway design standards, they're normally set by the states. They're generally followed by local governments and done by their engineers or public work departments, public safety agencies. They often are based on the Green Book standards, the National Green Book standards, policy and geometric designs of highways and streets. Typically, a lane is about 12 feet wide. It's designed for high-speed travel. But you may have other approaches, context-sensitive design or complete streets or traffic calming, that you may change that width. Complete streets is planning for all users, bicyclists, walkers, pedestrians, and buses and traffic and everything. There's a variety of modes and a variety of ages and trip types that it addresses. It's planning for all users, though. Here, I'll show you some complete streets where you may have medians and separation of different types of uses. You may have a bus lane versus the car lanes. You may have bicycle lanes or other types of things, So there may be a whole side of things and looking at the speedway. Parking dimensions and management, dimensions based on accessible and angle parking. You try to minimize off-street parking requirements based on parking generation. And your maximum rates, establishing maximum rates are now a smart growth option to try to decrease the amount of parking and try to promote transit use and other options. And of course, another alternative, you may try to share parking with nearby properties like churches or things like that. Have some type of agreement with them for when you need them in your peak, when it's not their peak. Here are general parking generation factors. Unfortunately, this has come up on the exam sometimes too. And they've been known to ask things like, a medical center may have 0.1 to 7 point spaces per employee. Or they may ask about offices. Okay. 0.5 to 3 per 1,000 square feet or something like that. They've been hit and miss, so we don't have any standard to give you. The only one that's we've heard recently has been the library. But in the past, they've had some of these others. You'll see it in the past essay or comments a little bit. Think. Congestion pricing is something that's now one of the rage. And this started with high occupancy vehicle lanes, the lanes that if you had 2 or more people in it, you could go into those lanes. And now we're getting into high occupancy toll hot lanes or eventually congestion pricing of lanes so that you can use these toll lanes, but if you're using it at a high demand time, your fee is higher than it would be if you're using it as a low time. So it's to try to control a little bit the amount of congestion, and if you want the freer lanes, you get to pay for them. So you can also have express lanes or managed lanes, like they have in Chicago, for instance. And where the future is going, and you're already starting to see it in places like London and New York City, is you have managed urban entry points. In other words, you get charged for going into the downtown. So they will have, in essence, a toll system, or even in some cases a restriction on who can go in. You have to be permitted to go into certain areas. So it either charges you a fee or it restricts your access to certain areas. Those are managed urban entry points. Traffic calming measures. These are measures to try to slow down traffic speeds on a roadway. Speed bumps, or humps, not bumps, but humps, or speed tables, which are a little more elongated, or raised crosswalks, or putting rumble strips in, or roundabouts, or street closures, or diverters, chicanes, speed monitors. There's an example of a table. You can see it says speed hump, but it looks like it's almost a table. May not be quite long enough. But all of these are trying to get at controlling.
Excuse me, Henry?
Yes?
Is there not like a movement to like replace a lot of traffic lights with roundabouts? Could you just possibly comment on that?
Yeah, I think something may come up on that in a minute. It's more efficient for cars. It's not necessarily such a good idea for bicycles. There are other issues, but here's like crosswalks, things like that. Here's your roundabouts where they're trying to do it. But imagine if you're a bicyclist and want to get over here. It gets a little bit more. There's many places where you a little bit more at risk. But yes, there is a movement to try to place where you can do it, where it's not such a great idea as much on arterials as it is on less than arterials, from my frame of reference. Do we have one of the transportation people online that wants to talk about when they're using it? Is anybody? Okay, he may not be on today. But yes, there is some movement to do that. We've seen it more here locally, but it's usually our 4 lanes that are not full arterials. They're a little bit slower speed road. And of course, there's
Henry. I'm sorry. I don't mean to just throw this in your face. It's just I'm pretty sure, just because I'm a civil engineer, I'm pretty sure there's also larger volume like freeway arterial proposals out there.
Oh, sure, there are some. Washington D.C.'s got one. It's a major one. You know, when you get down in, coming in from the Beltway from the northwest, and
the idea is that you have some dedicated turn lanes and some through lanes, and supposedly.
Yeah, all I'm telling you is it gets very confusing, and there is also resistance against it to some degree.
Okay.
But yes, let me see if I've got. Even unlikely, they tend to be minor. Roundabouts have a central to blah, blah, blah. So our roundabouts really safer. They're safer than traditional stop sign or signalized intersection. They are that way, but not if you're a bicyclist. Again, there's been a lot of push on it over the time frame. But yes,
maybe during the Q&A, the gentleman maybe also might have a comment on Saturday.
Well, yeah, he doesn't appear to be on right now. So. All right, there's a bulb out or chicane. That's actually a chicane because it's got it at both ends. So here you're seeing that the lane shifts this way and shifts that way. So you've got a chicane here that forces you to slow down to do that. And there's a bulb out, it's only on one. Look, it could be on 2 sides, yeah. Where it comes out, and by taking away that extra lane there, it forces you to go out. Now that's bad news, of course, if you're a bicyclist, unless you can go back up this way. But anyway, another term that's come up sometimes on the exam is wooners. It's a Dutch term. It's basically gateways. It's basically gives priority to or equal access, depending on the type, to pedestrians. Here it's walkers, kids, automobiles. Okay, have equal right of way. They're typically curves to slow traffic. Amenities such as trees serve dual purpose of forcing it to slow down. Intermediate parking so that do not form a wall. But a wooners is basically a place where you have equal access and right of way for a series of users. Okay. Transitory development. This basically most associated with Peter Calthorpe. And you have pedestrian-friendly streets. You have parking within or behind structures. You have mixed uses. You have density of land uses about a little greater than 7 dwelling units per acre. You have street connectivity. Blocks are less than 600 feet apart. You have public spaces. You have attractive transit terminals, and you have transit services to multiple destinations on short headways. And that's just general. You have intermodal logistics centers and inland ports to try to accommodate going between rail and truck. So you got the rail coming in, then they load it off, often from ports. then they'll load it off, get into truck traffic wherever, or get loaded back onto rail going someplace else. So they're intermediate, they're located off the coast, and they move freight between different modes, particularly associated with the ports. Transportation Demand Management, TDM, known as Vehicle Miles Traveled Reduction Strategies. So you're kind of going to try to cut down on how many overall miles are traveled. Okay, you do this by telecommuting, 4-day work weeks, ride sharing, transit use, bicycling use, walking use. It has the least amount of capital required, and that's been something that's come up on the exam also. So TDM, trying to manage your demand of your transportation system by doing things like telecommuting, 4-day work weeks, ride sharing, things like that, doesn't take a lot of cash. Transportation control measures, these are specified in the Clean Air Act. These are intended to, it's a little similar to DDM. You're trying to reduce emissions in non-conformity areas, among other things. Examples may be improved public transit, traffic flow improvements, high occupancy vehicle lanes. You're trying to do certain controls on your transportation network to try to make it work better. Shared ride services, pedestrian bike facilities, flexible work schedules. Transportation system management. This requires more capital, but it's less than normal traditional roadway or new roadway building. You're trying to improve the operational efficiency of the system, and you're doing this by things like signal timing optimization, like trying to have trackers, detectors that see when traffic is coming, so you know that when other traffic can merge onto interstates, things like that, or to freeways. This may be trying to get deal with your turning lanes or your pavement striping improvements, or trying to deal with how you deal with special events, trying to have special strategies for, Panthers hockey game, or, Dolphins. Well, yes.
I'm not sure about any other state, but here in California, we have the insurance companies are charging per mile, how many miles we drive per day. They're charging us that with a premium based on how many miles we drive per month. That's how it works here in insurance.
Well, is that, yeah, there's different other strategies. You've also got parking cash out programs where they're trying to, they'll give you money rather than have parking places for you if you use mass transit or use ride sharing or other modes to get to work.
Yeah, that's what in government, they give us a subsidy for traveling by train instead of traveling by car. So,
Right.
yeah.
Parking cash out program. I know that's a California program as well as and the other is I'm trying to think of the term. It's got pricing in it. It's not congestion pricing, but it's I don't know if he's got it here or not. Let me look that one more. Yeah, that doesn't sit there. Can you remember the name of it?
Is it based on fuel consumption?
It's based on how many miles you travel.
Okay.
And it's got a
the BMT?
No, not it's got another special transportation number, and I can't remember. It's not congestion pricing, not reimbursement.
I can look my insurance policy, probably mentioned that.
Well, it's like a mileage-based user fee for transportation, vehicle mile traveled, but it's value pricing is another term though. Mileage fee concept. These are all similar things, where basically what they're doing is they're realizing that cars are getting more efficient. The miles per gallon is going up, and so the amount of gasoline tax that you're collecting for the same amount of mileage is going down, so they're trying to come up with alternate ways to deal with that. And it's mileage travel type pricing, mileage vehicles travel tax, VMT tax. There's another term too, but this is basically what he's talking about. It's a policy of charging motorists based on how many miles they traveled. Has been proposed in various states. This is it's the deal with replace, supplement the fuel tax because we're increasingly having fuel efficient vehicles. VMT fuel works in Oregon, Illinois, places, but it's got another name too. But anyway, if you remember it as VMT or mileage-based tax or road user charge, these are all other terms used for it. I don't know what they call it in California, but I know there's another term too, and I just can't think of it. All right, sorry guys. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. So that anyway, that's know the difference between TDM, TCM, and TSM. And hopefully you won't see them just by the acronyms. Functional classification is something that sometimes comes up on the exam. Roadways are delineated functionally by how fast, how far, and what the speeds are, things like that. Functional classification goes from interstates to freeways to principal arterials, minor arterials, collector roads, local roads, and that's based on one of the relationships based on that is how much, one of the things you can think about is if you're an interstate, okay, you have a large portion of your mileage traveled happens on interstates, and yet they are a lot fewer miles of roadway than, say, local roads. Local roads have a lot less total miles traveled on, but they have a lot larger number of mileage of roads constructed in that category. And of course, there's a big difference in speed and flexibility. You know, interstates are very controlled access. These you have basically no roads. So local roads, you know, collector roads pick up local roads. Minor arterials picked up collectors. Principal arterials pick up a lot of minor arterials. Freeways picked up, so on. There's a hierarchy. And you can also think of mobility. This is the land access, how much land access is provided versus what the degree of mobility is of those particular roadways. So local roads have a large amount of land access. Huge amount of land gets accessed transportation-wise by local roads. But arterials provide the most mobility, the most being able to travel distances, things like that, but aren't directly serving a large portion of the land access. So the hierarchy is based on access requirements, and of course you can coordinate these plans with future land use. So this is a relationship of functional classification systems versus traffic mobility and land access.
Is land access the same thing as number of intersections? I'm
No,
sorry if I got
land access is how many cars can come out and go onto a local road versus how much land can go out and go directly onto an arterial. And if you get up here where you're talking about interstates, it's very low. Very few land uses have access directly to interstates.
Okay, thanks.
Where down here is most of your land use has an access to a local road. Okay.
Thank you.
Now, when you get into, we talked about this before, but you know, this is a very connected. This gets into your the number of nodes and the number of links. We talked about this before. your connectedness. Okay. And when you're a very connected system, you probably can travel a lot shorter distance than you can going out like that because you're not very connected. So this is much more connected. These both two have the same lane miles, but there's a lot greater capacity and shorter travel time between areas than there are in this one. If you want to go from here to say there, or from here to there, it's a lot more convoluted way to get there than going just there. Just like from A to B here, it's a lot shorter way than A to B going that way. Okay? Or even more draconian if this was A and this was B, so you were like here to here, you'd have to go, all the way around there, come back here just to go there, just to go that distance. Whereas in this one, you could just go boom, or boom, boom. Okay. Parking cash out, this is an employer-sponsored program that allows employees to opt out of having a parking space and they receive a payment for it. This is big in California. State employer who leases or owns a space pays the employee not to park there. California state law requires certain employers who provide subsidized parking to offer a cash allowance in lieu of a parking space. It was intended to reduce vehicle commute trips and emissions by having employees take transit, biking, walking, or carpooling to work rather than driving. Walk score. We've talked about this, I think, a little bit before, but there's a website that assesses the walkability of a particular location with a number of nearby amenities being the leading predictor of whether people walk. Walk score lists businesses, parks, theaters, schools, other common destinations. And the mission is to promote walkable neighborhoods with walkability and transportation costs being key part of choosing where to live. We covered this when we did urban design, sustainability, new urbanism, and all like that. We talked about this a little bit more. The algorithm awards points based on the distance of the closest amenity in each category. If you're less than a quarter mile away from each one of those amenities, you get the maximum number of points. If you're greater than 1 mile away from, say, a grocery store or someplace like that, you get no points for that category. Each category is weighed equally. Points are summed and normalized for a score between 0 and 100. You're very walkable if you're 100. You're not walkable at all if you're 0.
Henry?
Yes.
That pictorial, I think it was the LOS pictorial comparisons of those levels A through F. I know it's a very simplistic question in this case, but okay. I mean, basically you get a better walk score the closer to F. Wait a minute.
Well, that level of service has nothing to do with walk score.
What was that pictorial chart you just showed us where some had more sidewalks and pedestrian access and the ones had less?
Well, that was walking, but that's not a walk score issue.
Then what was that pictorial comparison?
That was sort of a level of service on trying to get to other modes of transportation and get to this one you're talking about, right? This is trying to get levels of service to pedestrian type of uses. And this is just a generic thing that some transportation people are getting to, where you've got here safe, segregated sidewalks that are easily walkable. You don't have to worry about cars coming and hitting you, things like that. That's good level service. Where you got a sidewalk where you could get hit moderately easily here by a car, that's in the middle. And where you got here, where you got no sidewalks, so if you're going to have to walk out here, or you see like people here, they're walking right there, right next to the roadway, that's very dangerous. So that's a low level service. That walk score.
So one's more segregation and one is more just access?
This is more level of service. The other is a degree of walkability. How walkable is your area? And let me just pull that up, show you what. Well, walk score Let me go down. Walk score is based upon these different criteria and how walkable how close things like grocery stores are to you, schools are to you, things like that. Okay. And so that's a score based on that. Let me do it this way. Let's just go, when in doubt, let's just go here and get it, pull it up.
So access to amenities and
right.
Resources.
How close
We
How
saw the
close
chart.
Sorry?
You saw the chart for 1,000 square feet one, remember? For library and everything. That's the chart you have.
Basically, if you're less than a quarter mile to all of these. So the scores work this way. If you're, the Walker's Paradise is you're real high. You're basically.
So just getting the things by foot is just pedestrian.
Yeah, walk score is just about walking, right?
All right.
Thank you for
that. Sorry, it was an easy one. Thank you.
All right.
I just didn't want to get.
Okay. So basically, if you're looking at how far away like my house, how far away is it from businesses, parks, theaters, schools, grocery stores, things like that, common internet demonstration. If I'm less than a quarter mile, then I get a maximum number of points for it. If I'm greater than a mile to walk to one of those, I get no points. Okay. And so, like I live in a suburban residential, I can walk along the street to do my dogs and things like that. But if I want to go to a grocery store or even any store that sells food, I'm further than a mile away. Okay. If I want to go to a school, I'm with the exception of the elementary school, I'm further than a mile away. If I want to go to a theater, I'm further than a mile away. So I'm much more car dependent because I'll be a much lower score down closer to 0 than I would be 100. If I were living in places like, a more downtown type of area where you've got restaurants and little grocery stores and commercial and things like that, I have a much higher walk score because it's much easier to walk to those other things. That's different than the level of service, which was focused a lot on more how safe the walking area was. Okay. All right. Going into something else, there's something about, we haven't seen this quite come up on the exam yet, but automated vehicle classification system, different levels. Level 0 is the driver completely controls the vehicle all the time. Level 4, the vehicle performs all safety critical functions for the entire trip, with the driver not expected to control the vehicle at any time. So the vehicle controls all functions from start to stop. It could include unoccupied cars. That's a level 4. So these are just the different degrees of automated vehicle classification. Level 2 is at least 2 controls can be automated, such as adaptive cruise control, in addition with lane keeping. Okay, so different degrees of automobile automation. Autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles. You see here where they're wireless controlled. They're getting signals. These are things that we're going to have to increasingly work with and plan for in the future. And of course, we're getting electrical vehicles and shared use vehicles where, we're going to need to eventually start putting more and more power stations. Like out at Wellington, they have one parking space reserved just for electric vehicles so they can power up. They're going to do it free off the powering things. And that's basically it for the main transportation planning presentation I want to do. At that, I'm going to go into some transportation practice questions. Any other questions right now? If you want to get a little bit more insight, like on this one, since the TPO director is not here, you could go back and listen to when he gave this presentation in the fall. You might have a few more insights in a few other areas. I tend to try to focus on what we know comes up on the exam a little bit. Some things like this question, we've seen it in the past, but it hasn't come up recently. Which degree of angle do parallel parking spaces typically have.
D for David, maybe.
So I heard D for David. Anybody else?
I think it's A, 0, but I don't know why those are percentages. Those should just be degree symbols.
Oh, they're right. They should be.
Yeah.
I don't know why he didn't. This is not one of my questions.
Kind of throws you off a little.
Maybe because he couldn't do a degree symbol. Should be 0 degrees. I didn't even look at that. I just pulled it from Mike, and for whatever reason, he either had it or it didn't come over. Could be when I copied it over, it went from a degree symbol to a percentage symbol. That could be the other thing that could have happened, and I didn't pick up on it. Anyway, parallel parking spaces are parallel to the curb and designed with no angle. All right. Which level of service is likely to trigger discussions regarding improvements to highway and roadway networks in the city? And this one always is a fun one.
C?
Answer C or level of service C?
Answer C as in cat.
His answer is actually level of service C. And remember, he's dealing with this, he's talking about a city, but any city. So they don't, it's not necessarily big urbanized. Like for us, it's more D, I agree. We start talking about it. So this is when you first start triggering discussions regarding improvements. Many communities have used the level of service, based their trigger on level of service C. Waiting until the LS is declined below the level of service C may result in significantly higher improvement costs. If you design alternatives, less likelihood that an acceptable level of service will be achieved. This is an APA question, an older APA question, but an APA question. So again, it's not what I would have thought in Florida, urbanized areas, but perhaps it's more, more out of the big city, Midwest, or other places. I can't tell you that. All right.
Henry,
Yes.
Before you go on, if we can go back up to the question we had before the previous question, what is the degree for angled parking?
For angled parking, about 45.
Yeah. You said 45? Okay.
Angle, if they're, well, just think about degrees from the curb. 0 degrees is they're right at the curb. 45 is partway out. 90 would be at a right angle to the curb.
Okay, so, thank you.
So 30 or 45 would be as you're starting to angle out. Okay.
Got it.
90 with 90 being at a right angle. We'll see how we do on this one. Which of the following is designed for speeds? Now, to me, the key here is it says exceeding 50 miles an hour.
It'd be D as in dog.
Yeah.
D as in dog.
Yeah. Major arterials have design speeds that often exceed 45 to 50 miles an hour. So that's what gave it to me was exceeding 50 miles an hour. And that meant that's going to be a major arterial, definitely. At least in my experience. If the transportation person's online, remember, you're the expert, I'm not. Although I did teach some transportation plan. I knew just enough to be dangerous. Computerized traffic model is useful in which of the following functions?
A.
I think he's going to say D. Yeah, he's going to say D. He's going to say you can use a traffic model to test the impact on different land use scenarios. You can test the effectiveness of various physical improvements. Are you going to, if you're going to put a new stoplight in versus a new turning lane in versus the new actual extra 2 lanes. And then also testing the impact of future zoning. You can take a look at zoning changes and see, okay, is that zoning change going to result in a need for having to have a 4-lane now rather than the 2-lane that we have there now? So it's an effective tool for testing future growth and physical improvement scenarios. Does that make sense? Do you understand why it's all of those?
Yes, makes sense.
Okay. Which of the following agencies is most likely to vote to increase road frontage requirements along specific road corridors?
Apple.
Apple, yeah. The Planning Commission. Of those groups there, of the 4 listed above, the Planning Commission is most likely to vote on revisions to the zoning ordinance to increase frontage requirements along certain corridors.
What's an example of a frontage requirement?
Anybody out there want to say? Setback, things like that. Any local planner want to talk about frontage requirements? Is the lot line separating a lot from the street layout? The minimum required frontage depends on the zoning district in which a property is located as well as the proposed use. That's the dimension of a lot abutting on the street, except for a corner lot. Lot frontage means the length of the front lot line measuring this street right away. Does that help at all?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Henry, does the Board of Appeals hear code violations and variance applications? What function does the Board of Appeals?
Okay, the best place to go for that. Oh, wow, one place. Okay, well, let's just do it. It's probably faster to just do it here. I also Pennsylvania guide. They'll hit building permit challenges, other types of things that they can do variances. Let's see, this one may have it.
Most of the questions are for variances.
Yeah, well, it depends on where you are, but yeah.
Yeah, isn't
Okay.
it different from state to state whether you have a ZBA and a planning board or you have a combined board?
Well, okay, yeah, and let's just look at the standard modeling. Let's just stop this and go here. APA planning standard state zoning enabling act. Because most of this comes out of the standard state. Let me see if I can search for it here without. Let's just look up one word and see if it does it for us.
There was a wiki, you went through it.
Yeah, I'll go back to the wiki. I'd have to copy this, do it PDA, then I'd have to make sure that it recognizes all the text. This probably has it in it also. It's just that I know if I go there, maybe not. Okay, let me try one more thing. And if not, then I'll go to where I was going to go. So. Okay. Planning and zoning commissions may also be approving agencies for permits and specific variances. Other jurisdictions may have separate board of adjustments and appeals that perform the function instead of the planning and zoning. In fact, some of the jurisdictions have, the zoning board of appeals can also deal like challenges of building permits and whatever else the state or local has allowed it to do.
Are we just trying to discuss what the basic functions of a zoning board of adjustment does?
Yes.
I mean, I might be able to speak on that a little bit. At least in New Jersey, they have three main functions. It's to hear variance requests. You can go for a interpretation of the zoning ordinance, and you can go for a zoning change, like a zoning amendment. But 99% of what they hear is just variance requests. So if you have a project that is not being developed as of right, you go to the zoning board of adjustment, generally variances. Everything else gets knocked back to the planning.
Yeah, that's one of the standard. What I was trying to get you to was the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act aspect, and I'm just going to, since we've spent this time on it, I'm just going to go there and find it for you. Let's see here. Study guides, chapters, Pennsylvania. Study guide. Okay. This is the Pennsylvania study guide, and they will tell you what a little bit. The State Standard Zoning Enabling Act also provided for the creation of quasi-judicial zoning boards, which was to hear appeals from the actions of administrative officer and interpret unclear provisions of the ordinance itself. That's two of the things you just mentioned. Modern zoning appeals is often called Board of Zoning Adjustments or Board of Zoning Appeals. And in Pennsylvania, they're called a zoning hearing. In many states, including Philadelphia, the board also decides on requests for variances and special exceptions. Okay. Now, you mentioned, however, one thing that is a little anathema to me, if I heard you right. Changes in zoning go to your board of appeals or your board of adjustments?
Yeah, so if you would rather not go for a variance, you can go before the board to try to change the zoning amendment. So then basically you would do that if you were proposing a development that wasn't as of right and you wanted it to be as of right. So you can go for a zoning amendment. So they hear like requests for zoning amendments.
I don't think in Florida, I'm not, guys, correct me if I'm wrong. Remember, I'm a state planner and a regional planner. I've not been a local planner. But I think that most local jurisdictions in Florida, that would happen with the planning commission and then have to be approved by the either the council or the county commission. To be, your legislative body would have to approve that zoning change. Does anybody have a situation in Florida that's online where the zoning change happens at the Board of Adjustment or the Zoning Board of Appeals?
Hey,
No,
I used to
Valencia-
work in Florida. It usually went from planning commission to board of county commissioners.
Right.
Gotcha.
Okay. So that's one little difference between New Jersey and here, I think. But anyway, this is the standard. What they're going to tend to ask you is more what the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act sort of set up. And there's more detailed explanation someplace. I can't get my hands on it right now, but the State Zoning Enabling Act, and if you look at it, which is on the APA website, you'll see what they stated out, what type of activities they proposed at the time, which most states have done, but now this is one area that states have tweaked. Even here in Florida, I'll have sometimes 3 different planners, and their 3 different locales will do it slightly different. What goes where and how it's done. Okay, Let's go on. Okay, we're going to do, and obviously not one of my questions, but which of the following are elements of an intelligent transportation system? And we didn't really talk about this too much tonight. Once in a while it comes up on the exam.
Say D.
D.
D, so he said all of them. And the answer is D. Technically integrated, coordinated transportation system features such as freeway management systems, advanced transportation, surveillance signal, and ramp metering, things like that. All right. Complete street is best described as
D.
which one? As in?
E as in Charlie.
Is in Charlie, yes. Complete streets is a transportation policy design approach that requires streets to be planned, designed, operated, and maintained to enable safe, convenient, and comfortable travel and access for users of all ages and abilities, regardless of their modes of transportation. And that has another past report, Complete Streets, and I'll try to remember to put that one on the FTP site too. MPOs are typically responsible for which of the following?
D as in David?
D as in David, 1, 2, and 4. Not typically responsible for regulating land use, construction of freeways. So they would be coordinate regional transportation planning. They'd be certifying the project to be federally funded and be consistent with regional plans, and they'd be planning for air quality. And I wrote this one particularly to put the air quality in there because people were having problems with that. That question was coming up and they were missing it. Federal legislature passed in the early 1970s required the formation. Let's see, just see if I've got it up. Oh, I don't have it up still. Let me see if I can bring it up though. So I had a question about who does air quality, about monitoring MPO responsibility, about air quality. An easy MPO if you want, who's responsible for monitoring air quality, role of, and of course they also had roadway classification, functional classification system, MPO air quality question, and MPOs work on air quality. Make sure that non-MPO folks have ingrained in their heads that MPOs work on air quality compliance. Okay. Okay, so federal legislation passed in the 1970s required the formation of MPOs for any urbanized area with a population greater than 50,000. MPOs were created in order to ensure that existing future expenditure transportation programs were based on a continuing cooperative and comprehensive 3C planning process. Federal funding for transportation projects programs channeled through the MPO. MPOs in air quality, non-attainment, and maintenance areas are required to ensure that emissions from transportation investments will not cause new violations or affect an area's schedule to attain the air quality standards. The Clean Air Act identifies the actions states and MPOs must take to reduce emissions from on-road mobile sources in non-attainment and maintenance areas. All right. I'm going to skip that one. County administrator calls you, the planning director, to his office to discuss the use of federal funds available for MAP 21 legislation. Among the potential projects you discuss include Well, I know you just went right over her, but in fact, one of these, it's going to be difficult. Because I think he took it off his slide. So I may give it away.
C?
No, C. So it's community-led planning for neighborhood revitalization around transit lines. It's using certain funds for transportation and infrastructure projects and construction of local ferry boat facilities. And I think he modified his and took that off. But we had that come up for a while about the local ferry boat stuff, but I haven't seen it for a year or two, so I'm not sure it's out there anymore. And last question we'll do, and I'll give these. Arturo Street is best described as? This is off the functional classification.
So bar.
Which one?
B for bar.
B for boy? Yes. Street that provides through traffic on a continuous route joining major traffic generators where access to abutting may be controlled. Okay. Principal arterials serve longer trips, carry the highest traffic volumes, and carry a large percentage of the vehicle miles traveled, 30% to 55% of all roadway mileage. On minimum roadway mileage constructed highways, only 4 to 12% of all roads, and provide minimal land access. Remember, they were sort of at the top of that figure that we had. Minor arterials interconnect the principal arterials. They provide less mobility, but slightly more land access. They distribute traffic to smaller geographic areas than principal arterials. And then urban collectors provide both land access and traffic circulation with the residential, commercial, and industrial areas by collecting and distributing to those areas. Local streets provide direct access to adjacent lands and access to higher classified roads. They are 5 to 20% of all vehicles miles traveled, but they're 65% to 75% of all the roads mileage that's out there. Okay. With that, I'll say good night, and then we will have class at 8:30. The only update I have on the exam are two things. Yesterday, from our state PDO, I heard, based on a conference call they had with all the state PDOs, that APA was looking at trying to see if there's not a way to administer and proctor the exam remotely. Then today, I heard directly from APA, in light of another question I asked him, that they had a conference call with Prometric, the testing center, today, and they will have some indication shortly about what's happening with the dates for the May exam. So that's all I know. I don't know that it's on or off. I don't know that they're going to do it via internet or not, but I've just told you the current status that I know. So, and I would assume that all the people that have signed up for the exam will hear probably before I do. One question I do have, based on one question I got today, was, are any of you, because of the emergency, having to undertake other work that's going to make it very difficult for you to take the exam? In other words, are any of you either contractually or because of who you work for going to be asked to be involved with other projects that you might not normally be assigned to? Like, for instance, I know that the governor is going to try to fast track a lot of road repair in the state. And that may have some implications for some people. They may be more busy than they would have otherwise been, things like that. And there may be some other scenarios like that, including one that I heard about today. If any of you do have that situation, let me know and I will take it back up to let APA know about it and ask them what to do if you need some relief. I'm not saying that I'll guarantee an answer, but they will try to answer it. And so anyway, it sounds like we'll hear something somewhat soon, but I don't know what that time frame is. Okay. Anybody got any last minute questions? Okay. With that, I'm going to say good night. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Henry.
Thank you.
Thank you.